Williams.
Ryan Sheffy.
And this is our guest, Claire Marshall. Claire works with me at the Daughters of the American Revolution, and today she's going to talk to us about one of the women in history that actually had a lot to do with the American Revolution. So welcome, Claire.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'm excited. So
I am too.
she has a really great story, guys, and yeah, this is going to be a good one. So Brian, what do you have to say?
Well, as always, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Welcome to the audience. Thank you for sharing part of your Sunday with us. Hope you're all well and healthy and safe.
That's awesome. So we're going to jump right in.
Well, do you want to say a little bit about Claire and the DAR and what she does?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Okay, so Claire works in genealogy, and she is the assistant director of applications. So basically, Claire is okay. I work on the end where we're doing the intake, and Claire actually checks it and makes sure everything's okay and make sure your information is correct. And if there's a problem, then she'll contact you and let you know that we need this, we need more information. Am I right so far?
You're totally on point. Yeah.
Make sure we need more information or something like that. And then once that's done, it'll come back to me. And then once it comes back to me, I'm the person that then go ahead and helps post it and puts it through, gives you your national number, mails out your certificate, and voila, you are now a member of the DAR. Mm-hmm. So we work through that throughout the month, and then at the end of the month, we turn to crazy women.
Yes, that's very true.
and we go from there. But as far as joining the DAR, do you have numbers on that? Like, how often do we go through all of that stuff?
In terms of like how many applications we
Yes.
process on a monthly basis
Yeah.
and things like that. We're in the roughly, I think the last report I saw was in the thousands about a month, maybe 1,500. It varies from month to month because it depends on how many applications we actually receive in the building that we can then process and
Right.
get through and everything. I believe we verified a little over 14,000 applications last year alone, which was one of our highest years on record. So it's a whole production. And I guess I'll just put in a shameless plug here for the DAR. If anyone is interested in joining, please feel free to visit our website, www.dar.org. And there's a lot of information there. There's a whole section on just join. And that'll show you everything you need to know about how to join, how to get in touch with local chapters in your area. There is a special little option called the chapter locator where you can put in your zip code and it'll take you directly to a listing of all of the chapters in your area and how to contact them and get in touch with a registrar who can help you with your lineage.
That's right.
Okay.
That's
I
right.
had to do that.
No, we want you to do that. We want you to do that. It's important because, you know, Women's History Month focuses on all of the women, and these women do so much. So can you tell us something about what they do throughout history, what they've done, and what they're doing now?
Yeah, so in terms of female patriots in what we call established in our system in the GRS, which is a genealogical research system, typically you see two types of service performed by women. It's either furnishing supplies or paying a supply tax, so contributing in some sort of financial way to the support of the American cause of independence. Or you see not a lot, but a decent amount of women were taken as prisoners of war. We categorize this kind of service as patriotic service. I can tell you that we have only one female who participated in a military capacity during the Revolutionary War, and I can talk a little bit about that, but she's not my main focus today. So it can be somewhat complicated to establish a female ancestor or patriot in our system, usually because of the fact that, you know, as a married woman, based on coverture laws in early colonial America, it was basically very difficult for a married woman to own property in her own right. Anything that she had, and basically her being, was sort of covered by that of her husband. So if you're a married woman during the Revolutionary War, you're not the one paying those taxes or furnishing those supplies. It is your husband who's doing that, and thus he gets the service. Now, if you're a widow, that's when we see a lot of female patriots have been established because their husband died either before the war or during, and then after his death, they're the ones providing those supplies or paying that tax, at which point they can then get service.
Okay.
So I'm curious, the women who were they taken as hostages or were they taken as prisoners of war?
Prisoners of war. But it kind of depends on the circumstance. Elizabeth here was absolutely a prisoner of war. Some sources, I should say, will claim that it was a deliberate move by the British, sort of in retaliation against her husband, who was a prominent figure of the Revolutionary War. Those claims can't be 100% corroborated, though, based on the sources that we have available to us today. But in her case, she was a prisoner of war.
Because again, Donnie and I are doing our own research on our ancestor Daniel Williams the second. What was really interesting to see is he made all of these provisional deeds. What was going to happen to his enslaved people in case, and he was between South Carolina and
North Carolina,
which was his one of his ancestral homes. So that whole period, he's going back and forth, and he's taking all of his enslaved people and his family from South Carolina to North Carolina, then back, and you can literally, and when you start plotting what he's doing with where the British were attacking, basically he was just trying to get his family and enslaved people out of the British hands, and they were literally just going back and forth over that border, and it just seemed chaotic.
Yes.
Just absolute chaos.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah. It really is. He's the one that ends up owning the guy that I was telling you about, Moses Williams. My grandfather,
yes.
four-time grandfather,
Yeah.
45 kids, that crazy guy. Yeah, so that's why we're doing so much work on him. That's our connection through John Williams and Kings Mountain.
Yes,
yeah.
that's it. And, I guess following on from what you were saying, I can really appreciate more what his wife, Luana Henderson, was going through, because he was out of the house pretty much for the most part.
Wow, I never thought about that.
Yeah, so you can imagine it. You can imagine them as a married couple sitting at the the dinner table, going, "Well, I've got to go fight in Kings Mountain, so you literally have to hold the fort, the kids, the animals, the farm, everything." And she clearly did it.
She clearly did. Yeah.
They kept everything together, but the onus of that fell on her. 'Cause like I said, he was off. He was out.
That's what it means. I guess when you're the mistress of the house, that's your job. But and that's somewhat similar to what happened here with our friend Elizabeth, is that her husband Francis was a very prominent figure in New York. He was a very wealthy merchant in the years leading up to the war. And then was, of course, he was part of the early New York Provincial Congress. He was elected to Continental Congress in 1775. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So a lot of the time, the family estate was in Long Island. So a lot of the time, he wasn't home. He was in Philadelphia or elsewhere. So Elizabeth was left to take care of everything. And by the time the war rolled around, she was probably in her 50s. We don't really have concrete information about her date of birth, date of death, things like that. So what we do have is estimated based on available information. Some sources say that she was born around 1715. Our sources at the DAR, we've said 1725, and that's pretty much made up. It's just, we know that she was married probably in 1745, and one of her eldest sons, who actually one of the few that lived to adulthood, was born in 1750. So roughly based on that, we think, okay, if she was probably in her early 20s when she got married in 1745, so fine, 1725.
Which are all very good points for people trying to do their research, because again, we don't necessarily have cut and dried years of birth.
We don't always know. That's right.
So you just try to acclimatize yourself or familiarize yourself when people of that generation were getting married for the first time, when they were having their first child, and say, well, somewhere between 18 to 20.
Yeah.
And that's where I get the geometry thing. I like math, so
good for you.
I do. I like math, and it reminded. I can always say that one thing about genealogy, it reminded me of math, because especially geometry, because I can remember in geometry how you had to prove proofs, and you always had to have a hypothesis, and you had to, do certain things, and you had to prove this angle. In order to prove this angle, you had to give a guesstimation first, and then go through whether it was right or wrong. And I'm like, that's what I'm doing with genealogy. I have to prove it. I have to find my write my hypothesis first, and then figure out if it's right or wrong. So I always try to explain it to people like that, but if they don't know
Geometry. But that's actually, I love that. That is such a great way to explain it, because you have a lot of people that submit their applications to the DAR, and they might have, maybe all they can find after a quick search is a family genealogy that was published in 2002, and it just says John Smith had 5 children and one was Martha. And it's like, okay, where's this information coming from?
How do you know?
How can we verify this?
Right.
And that's when you said, so I love that idea of having the hypothesis. Yeah. That's what I tell people to do with family genealogies. Now, some of them that you come across are, they've got sources out the wazoo. They're so incredibly written, and I wish every single one of them was like that. But unfortunately, that's not the case.
Right.
So it's always a great place to start. Like, you can use that as your hypothesis.
Right, and that's what I tell people. I'm like, you have to be able to prove it. You have to understand that when you're doing genealogy, you need to know that there's a possibility that oral history that you got is going to be wrong. Mm-hmm. And grandma might be telling you something wrong because she really don't want to tell you the truth.
Yep.
Or, in the case of so many of our families, there's so many common family names.
Yes.
Like Elizabeth Cox, whether it's spelled C-O-X or C-O-C-K-E.
Right.
There's 1,000 of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And literally 1,000 per generation.
Carrie
Exaggeration, I know, but it seems that way.
Yeah.
So it's easy to conflate two people, merge two people, confuse two people.
Right.
Remember what I was talking about William Holloway? I thought if I see that name one more time.
Well, you already know I be ready to throw my computer out the window when I see Carrie Brunson. That name irritates my soul.
Yeah.
So I'll be ready to die when I see that, because we have 1,003,400,000 Carrie Brunsons. Every time we turn around, there's a Carrie Brunson.
But seriously, it's like every time someone had a daughter, every one of them Carrie.
Somebody.
Yeah.
So you could have 5 Carries within the same family.
In the same.
Because every sister or every daughter is naming one of their daughters Carrie.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I've got before you get into Elizabeth Lewis, I have one other question for you. And are you getting the sense? Oh, the question's actually gone out of my head. But it had to do with movements of people. Carry on. It will come back to me. It's
So you
killing
wanna
me because
go
it was a really good question.
You want to go into?
Oh.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you get a sense that the British had a short list of families that they wanted to specifically target, that they thought if we can capture these people would really demoralize the Patriots?
So, yes, but I hesitate to almost say yes, because it's one of those things that from my personal research and feeling, yes, I do feel that, but can I actually corroborate that someone had sent down orders saying, you know what, these 5 guys who signed the Declaration of Independence, I want you to get them. So, I mean, because of course signing the Declaration of Independence was considered an act of treason. Mm-hmm. So it would stand to reason that anyone who had signed that document would be sort of marked or have I don't want to say a bounty on their head, but if that makes sense, that sort of like, okay, well, you chose to sign this document, and now instead of, trying you for treason, which is sort of what typically happened based on the rules of war, I think the British opted more for we're just gonna shoot you when we see you or hang you, or is in the case of what happened to Francis Lewis, Elizabeth's husband, just completely raze your estate, destroy everything, steal about, I think, in one of his letters after the war, he mentions that he lost about £12,000 after the British destroyed his estate. So you could make the case that people were deliberately targeted because of their patriotic sentiment. Whether or not you could prove that that was the reason they were specifically targeted, or if they were specifically targeted, that would be.
Because that's something that I'm trying to research about Major Pierce Butler of South Carolina and Georgia, because he had estates in both places, where the British, both in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, sailed up outside the island where he had his massive plantations, and basically just took hundreds of enslaved people and took them up to Canada. But it seemed deliberate. They're like, all right, you've been spouting your mouth off, saying all this anti-British stuff. You're a very high-profile person. You were a high-profile revolutionary. So guess what? While you're in Philadelphia, we're just going to sail our man-of-war ship, dock it outside your plantation, and just tell all of your enslaved people, all of you want to come with us, because we know that's going to hurt you.
Right.
We can't get you, but we can destroy as much of your property as we can get our hands on, and we'll take the rest.
Yeah. Which is very similar to what happened to Francis. They pulled a ship of war right outside because their estate was right on the water there, and just started firing cannons at the house sometime in September of 76. We don't know the exact date. But I mean, it's an interesting story, and I think it would make sense to make that claim that there were prominent figures of the Revolutionary War who it is, like I believe you said, demoralizing, or I think that's a great word for it. Just because, that's what you get, kind of thing. And in particular, what I thought was interesting with Francis is he was actually one of the merchants who was supplying a lot of supplies and food to men in Massachusetts in New York during the French and Indian War, and was actually taken prisoner for quite some time, I believe imprisonment for about 2 years, both in Montreal and then over into Paris. But the British, at the close of the war and once he was finally released, recognized that he was a valuable asset to the British Empire, given the amount of money that he had and the many different areas that he was involved in terms of shipping. And so he was actually financially compensated, but also given land in the New York colony, which is what he then used to purchase that estate in Long Island. Yeah. And then with the Stamp Act and everything, sort of turned his back on the British. So I have always kind of wondered if the reason that he was targeted is because they were like, hey, we gave you land after we negotiated your release, and then you turned around and started supporting the Americans. So, not really a loyal subject. So, yeah.
So, without further ado, if you would like to introduce Elizabeth Lewis.
Yeah. So, Elizabeth Lewis was the wife of Francis Lewis. Her maiden name was Ainsley. She was the younger sister of Edward Ainsley, who was one of Francis's partners in an import-export firm that he established in New York City. So we talked a little bit about her date of birth and how we don't really have a lot of information on that. So the reason I started looking into her was in the March of 2018 publication for the DAR's American Spirit magazine. We did publish an article on Elizabeth Ainsley Lewis. And I was asked by our director at the time to do a little fact-checking for it and to corroborate the claim of whether or not she had been specifically targeted because of her husband's prominence in the Revolutionary War. So when the British invaded Long Island in August of 76, that's where lore starts to indicate that, word got around that this guy, Francis Lewis, his estate is right here, so maybe we'll just go and get that guy. So we know that sometime in September of 1776, the British showed up one night. It was, I believe, it was a party of soldiers commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Birch, who were authorized to basically go and destroy the estate. Some authors claim that part of their marching orders were to also then take Elizabeth as prisoner, or whether or not that just happened as part of the circumstance because Francis wasn't there. The next best thing is, okay, well, we'll take your wife. So before I get into the exact events of that day, I just want to talk a little bit about where my information is coming from. So her great-granddaughter, Julia Delafield, in 1877 published a biography of her mother. It was great-grandmother. So it was a biography of Francis Lewis and Morgan Lewis. Francis Lewis, of course, Elizabeth's husband. Morgan Lewis was their eldest son, who was the grandfather of the author. And she always described Elizabeth as being very sweet-tempered, well-educated, very calm, loving wife. One of my favorite anecdotes of her, which I am going to read out because this is directly from Julia's text, so this is before the Revolutionary War took place. She goes, "One night, Mrs. Lewis was aroused by a noise. In the corner of the room, she saw a man dressed in black. She sat up, raised a loaded pistol ready at her side, and called, 'Who's there?' No answer. 'Speak, or I fire.' No answer. She fired. When a light was procured, a hole in her black dress showed that a steady hand had aimed the weapon."
Hey now.
So,
hey now.
I feel like that gives us a lot of information about who she was as a person.
Yes.
Because she woke up in the middle. Now, granted, she was looking at a dress and not
Little
an actual.
paranoid. Little paranoid.
Little paranoid. But she had a loaded pistol next to her bed, and she knew how to use it.
Yes,
because
she did.
was a good shot.
So let me tell you who she reminded me of. NCIS. Ziva David slept with a gun.
Ziva.
That's all. So that's what she reminded me of. That was good. I like that. I like
It's
that.
a good one.
And it also reminds me of, I'm not going to name names, but a newspaper clipping that we read from Edgefield
Oh,
where
wow.
we have a family member, I think it was the 1920s,
1920s.
had a bit of a domestic issue
Dispute.
with her husband, or partner at the time.
Yeah.
She was fearful of her life. He comes rolling up the driveway. She goes up to this is a second story window
Okay.
with a rifle or a shotgun. She got him. In his
In
car.
his car.
In his
Oh,
car.
She
is
got
From a second story
from the
window.
second floor.
That's impressive. So she
Yeah.
was also an excellent
She was
shot.
an
is
excellent
what
shot.
I'm taking from
We
that.
affectionately refer to her as the Black Annie Oakley of
Yes,
Edgefield.
ma'am. Yes, yes.
I like that. I
Yes,
like that.
I did too. I was like, I'm impressed.
Yeah.
I need to be like you when I grow up. So,
Good one.
but yes, that's awesome. So
That is
she
an awesome
little
story.
paranoid,
Yeah.
but yeah, she did that.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to her character too, that instead of screaming for help, she stood her ground. And that does kind of tie into another little story. This is related by Julia Delafield, the author. So we skip to when the British have invaded Long Island. There is a manhunt for Frances, but Frances is away in Philadelphia. Elizabeth is at home taking care of the house. Now, all of her children at this point are older and grown, so it's just her and her servants and whatnot. So the British show up and they bring a ship of war around and just start blasting the house. So this is taken directly from the text. As the soldiers advanced on one side, a ship of war from the other fired upon the house. There was nothing to be done. Mrs. Lewis looked calmly on. A shot from the vessel struck the board on which she stood. One of her women called out, "Run, mistress, run." She replied, "Another shot is not likely to strike the same spot," and did not change her place.
And
Oh,
can
so
I
she
say-
had balls.
Really, yeah.
Can I say those British men of war ships? They are not small. They are huge. They're
Yeah.
they're built to be intimidating.
Yes.
So you literally have a bank of cannons, probably about anything from a dozen to 16, because it was on more than one level, all pointed at your house.
She
And
is.
she stood there.
And she stood there.
She's like, oh, it's not coming again, so I'm
You
not
know,
tripping.
lesser
If I move,
people
I'm gonna get
would-
hit.
Exactly.
That's what she was saying.
Right,
If I
she
move,
was like,
I'm gonna get hit.
"You go
So
right here.
I'm gonna stay
Fine.
right here. It's
Staying.
good.
Like,
Wow.
that's what I mean. Lesser people would have run screaming into the night. And I mean, granted, she was already in her 50s or 60s, roughly around that age. And apparently, some sources do say she was in ill health already at that point in her life. But she just stood there.
Wow.
And I think like that just shows, that speaks to her courage, which I think in turn, courage and strength of character, which I think is what helped her get through the next several months, which is sort of what happens here as of this night.
Wow.
So I have one more little anecdote here. So the soldiers come in. The house is being destroyed. They're destroying everything. Furniture, papers, books. Everything's all gone. And one of the soldiers, this is another story according to her great-granddaughter, one of the soldiers jumped down and started trying to tear the buckles off her shoes because he thought they were gold. And in fact, they were what I think they call it pinchback, which is just like, it's like zinc or copper or something like that, a metal alloy that looks like gold but isn't actually gold. And so this guy starts trying to tear off the buckles of her shoes. And she just calmly tells him, "All is not gold that glitters." So, like, your house is burning to the ground. There are soldiers everywhere. Everything's being destroyed. Someone is literally trying to take the shoes off your feet. And she has the time to kind of, like, reprimand him. Like, okay, buddy. Like, watch out what you're doing
You
here.
need to calm down just a little bit. I'm gonna need you to take a chill pill for
Yeah.
a second. Gather yourself and understand that all this is just not. It's not all anything that glitter. It ain't always gold, son. Calm down.
Yeah.
I love
And
her.
at this
I
point,
love
it
her.
was like, yeah. So she's a great character
She is.
of history for how she stood up for herself in these moments.
Wow.
It would be nice if we had an alternate source to be able to corroborate this, because this, I think it still is lore. This is written down by her great-granddaughter, you know, who says that all of these stories were told to her by her grandfather, who was Elizabeth's second son. So there is some truth to it. And so at this point, Elizabeth is taken prisoner, and she's held in Manhattan for a lengthy period of time. The exact amount of time is difficult to determine. So her great-granddaughter said it was around 3 months. Frances's his correspondence during and after the war did seem to indicate that while she may have been released after several months, she was still detained in New York and couldn't leave. So it looks like her period of detention was about 8 months, starting in September of 1776.
So she was basically jailed for 8 months.
At least she was jailed, I think, at least for 3 to 4 months, maybe a little bit longer. Sources kind of differ, so it's hard to know exactly how much time she was physically in prison. And a lot of the information that we do get and where her service comes from, her service for the DAR, is actually through George Washington's correspondence during the war, because he was the one who negotiated her release from prison. Yeah, actually, the picture right here, this is a medal that the DAR awards, and that is Elizabeth Ainsley there at the bars of the window with her shackles on. And the stories go that she was not allowed a change of clothing. She was not allowed to communicate with anyone outside of prison. She was given the same food that all prisoners were given, which, from sort of the rules of war and from what I understand of that time, generally speaking, more prominent figures would have received better treatment.
Because I was going to ask, just to be clear, she wasn't under house arrest.
No,
she wasn't stationed with a British general or a major. She was in prison.
Literally.
She
in
was
prison.
in prison, yes. And so that's, I think, the best thing that we have to corroborate the claim that her treatment was deliberate because of her husband's position. Because sort of why else would an elderly woman, the wife of a prominent figure, be treated in such a harsh way? And George Washington himself, a lot of his correspondence with General Howe was with General Howe while they were negotiating the release of Mrs. Lewis and a few other wives who'd been taken prisoner of other prominent men.
So were those other wives treated the same as she was, or was she treated worse?
So I couldn't quite answer you that. I can tell you that we did not treat the wives of British soldiers in the same way, because Washington himself, basically the way it worked to get Elizabeth's release is that Washington specifically detained the wives of two prominent British, I can't remember exactly what their position were, but British soldiers, and held them from entering New York City until Elizabeth's release could be secured. And I know in one of Washington's letters, he writes to General Howe saying, look, okay, we don't treat our prisoners of war like this, but if you guys are going to continue treating your prisoners of war like this, we have no option but to do the same. And I will detain these two women until Mrs. Lewis can be released. And of course, in one of those letters, he does mention the fact that he is going to allow these two women that he's held to bring in changes of clothes and things like that, at which point, because of that, Elizabeth is finally allowed a change of clothing. Yeah. There was a servant who was allowed to come into New York to provide her with that, and as the story goes, to give her some bread.
And for people who can't quite envision it, prisons in this time period were hellholes. They were just beyond squalid.
Yes. I mean, disease running rampant, no food or moldy food, or no... if you're in New York in the winter, no heat, no insulation on these things. So, I mean, she became seriously ill.
And if that picture is any depiction, she wasn't even held with just women.
Because it was men in there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So no privacy, no, nothing.
Yeah. And I
no
mean,
protection.
No protection.
I mean, nothing. She didn't even have her gun to shoot him if necessary. Because she could have protected herself. I mean,
as is evident,
she could have protected herself. But wow.
So yeah, and I believe I read somewhere that about 10,000 American prisoners of war died of neglect during the Revolutionary War. And so I think it speaks to her strength of character that she did manage to survive. She never fully recovered, though. She spent most of it, it sounds like she contracted tuberculosis while in prison, consumption, as it was called. And she basically spent the remaining two some odd years of her life bedridden and seriously ill, and died sometime after March of 1779. She was alive to witness her son Morgan's marriage, which occurred, I think, the 2nd of March, 1779. So that's the last recorded event that we have of her. But
so how did you guys prove? So again, when we do what we do, you have someone who comes in and says, I'm a descendant of Elizabeth Lewis. How are you guys proving her? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, so through Elizabeth herself, we only have one child established. And as you know, back in the day, we did not require proof of your lineage and
Right.
things like that.
Right.
So Elizabeth was first established, I believe, in 1924 was when the first application came in through her. So we didn't actually ask for any proof of anything. However, through her husband, who's also a patriot in our system, there have been more recent children established. And they were established through sort of the same kinds of documentation that you would see with any other patriot. The child, Morgan, through Francis was established using his obituary because Morgan himself was a prominent figure in New York. So his obituary, we're using marriage records, land records, probate records in particular. So it's nothing special, so to speak. But in terms of her service, sort of that prisoner of war status, the patriotic service that she's been given in our system, was verified using George Washington's papers during the Revolutionary War. And that's actually one of the biggest problems that we have with female patriots, is how to prove their service. Now, not every instance is going to be an Elizabeth Lewis scenario where George Washington himself is describing their imprisonment and all of the details that we can use to prove service. It is somewhat easier when you have a simpler service, such as furnishing supplies or paying a supply tax, because then you have that information on, in one of our sources, which is, the Virginia Revolutionary War public claims. You can see that someone, there's a receipt of payment to a specific person for this thing on this day. So you can see that Elizabeth Smith was paid 50 pounds for 8 bushels of wheat or something like that. And that right there, that counts as service. So it's a little bit easier to corroborate that.
I'm not sure if it's the same form. There's forms that I've seen on Fold 3 where people they weren't combatants, but they provided material aid, like cows and corn and all that kind of thing. I can't remember the name of the form though, but you can actually pull out quite a bit of information from those.
Oh yeah.
Is that the same form that you're talking about? Where people would, after the end of the revolution, they basically put in kind of their receipts, going, well, if we can get reimbursed for our aid to the Continental Army, that would be great.
Yeah, and those absolutely do exist. We do have would you say South Carolina? Is that what you said? Or there's is it the stub entry indents too?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, that is one of our standard sources that we use, which is, I always mess up the full name. I think it's the stub entry indents to Revolutionary War claims or something like that.
That's close.
Yeah.
That's close.
And so those are receipts of payment, exactly. Yeah. So it kind of depending on where you were residing. I know in New Jersey there are also Revolutionary War single slips where people submitted claims after the war was over and say, hey, the British burned my house, can I get a little financial compensation? So you can get service from that, in particular as a female patriot. Of course, your husband would have had to have kicked it in order for you to get that service. I think in some rare cases, we might have had it where you might have a divorce or something like that, where a woman's legal status then sort of reverts back to being what they call, because there's like, in coverture laws in colonial America, there's what they call the femme sole and the femme couvert. So like, femme sole means like a single woman, and then femme couvert is like covered. So covered under her husband. So that's sort of like, as a femme couvert, you did not have the right to buy land in your own right. You did not have the right to inherit land in your own right. Anything that you had went to your husband.
Wow. So we're covering women's history and suffrage right now.
And speaking of that, if any of you have female ancestors in the colonial period who were in Maryland colonial women during this period specifically had the right to vote. Ended up being taken away from them, but there is, in the Maryland archives, you can actually see the petitions and those kind of voting records, which is really, really amazing.
Yeah. So you think this is what kind of sparked them, like, I want my voting rights back, like what we were just talking about? Yeah, okay, everybody's gone off the war, so I have to know how to do this, and now that everybody's back, okay, now you can go back and being barefoot and pregnant again, and be like, but I don't want to be barefoot and pregnant anymore.
Hard pass.
I want to do this. I want to do this, and I don't want to not vote anymore. I want to vote. So that could have sparked everything that we're talking about right now.
And the other place I've seen women mentioned is when their husbands file for their pensions. Obviously, the surviving husbands who came back file for their pensions. Oh, while I was away fighting at Yorktown, the British attacked my farm and my wife did this. Kind of a thing.
Wow.
I don't think that. Well, no, actually, that I would imagine that getting something like that, even if it wasn't firsthand, would that be qualifying for the DAR?
It would depend. It's kind of a case-by-case basis with something like that. So I don't want to just blanket say yes, because it's sort of like, yes, he's making that claim in his pension, but that's maybe 40 years later. So do we have a more contemporary source that could corroborate that? Did he, petition the General Assembly at, in 1785? Or did he submit some sort of claim like what we were talking about closer to the end of the Revolutionary War to say, hey, the British stole 5 of my horses, can I get compensated for that? So, like I said, it would depend on what we actually got in terms of proof.
Because, again, what makes Elizabeth's story really interesting on another level for me is it's one of the few stories we actually have that I've seen. I'm not saying that there's not more out there, where, a woman was actually actively involved, taken prisoner. Most of the accounts I get are secondhand accounts or indirect accounts. Like I was saying, their husband might have written, oh, while I was away fighting, my wife did this. Or,
Yeah. And that's what I like most about her story, is because you can really track the service of prisoner of war, that patriotic service, through Washington's correspondence. It took several letters over the course of several months between the Board of War, between Washington, to General Howe, to Francis Lewis, to organize this whole thing. So it's very well documented in sources straight from that time, which I wish it was the case for every female patriot that we had, but not always.
And again, that length of time for a woman who was probably sitting at the top tier of New York society at that time.
Absolutely.
So you can imagine if she wasn't a woman of, I guess, society, as they would have called it, she would have been lucky if she had ever left that prison again.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, like always, we have our family, our friends, our watchers ask questions. And we do have one question from Shelley Murphy. And there are 2 questions from Shelley. And Shelley said, is there a number of how many women patriots there are, and how many might be women of color?
Okay, so that's a great question. And unfortunately, the answer is a little bit more convoluted.
Of course.
So our database doesn't have a way of tracking whether a patriot is female or whether they are of color or not, because it's sort of like we don't care what color you were, so long as you participated in some capacity. So I can give you a rough estimate for how many female patriots we have, but in terms of how many are of color, unfortunately, I would not be able to provide an answer to that. And sort of, I could tell you right now, we have over 300 female patriots.
Is it that many?
So this is the caveat to this, though. So what I did, because there's no real way of searching for it, I just started plugging in by first name. So I put in like Elizabeth, Hannah, Abigail, Sarah, Margaret, sort of the common names that you would have for women during that time. And I came up with a total of 384 female patriots.
What?
However, some of these women might not have been looked at in 100 years. So whether or not that service is something that we can corroborate in an acceptable source would mean that, yes, they're in the system, but they might not be a patriot. So to speak.
Got it.
So in particular, we would have female ancestors that were established with service where, it was 1910 and someone submitted their application and they wrote, she was a nurse at Valley Forge. But we might not have any way of corroborating that in one of our acceptable sources. So we might not, while it might have been accepted in 1910 and no one's looked at it since then, when we get that new application, that's when we look at it again and we go, oh boy, like I have no way of proving this. So we have to close that line. So it depends. I did, there was a decent amount of those female patriots who were coded for maybe lineage or coded for service.
Actually, using that as an example, say the family lore is 5, 7, 8 times great grandmama was a nurse at a battle. Is there a place where battle records? I mean, I know Revolutionary War, colonial period. Did they really have time with the ink and a quill to actually write down every little thing that was going on? But is there kind of where would be the best, most likeliest place to look for that kind of information? Orders and this happened, or this is my staff at this particular camp.
Yeah, so that's where you have to get a little creative. So if you're lucky, you might be able to find a journal or an official recording of, the commanding officer in a particular camp who might have, might be a receipt of payment for 2 pounds to Susanna Smith for washing laundry. Something like that. If we could find something in like the captain's notes or commanding officer's notes that reference a service performed by a woman, then that's something that we can corroborate.
Okay.
But unfortunately, a lot of the sources, or at least a lot of the sources that we've been given for service for things like being a nurse, they're usually not from acceptable sources. What is kind of unfortunate is you get a lot of these claims, eighth great grandma was a nurse at Valley Forge, and that's coming from the family genealogy. But unfortunately, we don't take family genealogies as proof of service, usually because they're written significantly later and it's just family lore passed down. We're not able to actually corroborate that service in an acceptable source.
Wow. So is it harder? I mean, it's harder to prove women patriots than it is. Because I have to admit, as I'm doing my part, and I'm looking, I'm like, this is a female. This is crazy. Like, because I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, this is a lady that I'm putting in. How in the world did they get to this point? And I just never thought of a female patriot until I got to the DAR. Mm-hmm. So when Brian actually brought up, well, let's see if we can talk about, since we're doing Women's History Month, let's see if we can find someone to talk about female patriots. I'm like, okay, well, I work at the DAR. Let's do that. Mm-hmm. And then for you to come and say, oh yeah, I have the perfect person. I'm like, really? This is crazy. So it was really shocking to me to learn that there were female, and then you giving me this crazy number of 300. Even though I understand what you're saying, that some of them we can't corroborate. I get it. Mm-hmm. But just the fact that number is even in there, that's...
Sure. Well, because you say that, before I phoned you and we had the conversation, I was even trying to find if, a reputable historian had actually written a book about women and the women who fought or supported the American Revolution. There really isn't that much written about them, and the ones that do write about the ones that we kind of already know about, like Betsy Ross, Martha Custis, Martha Dandridge Custis, Washington, Dolly Madison. So the women, kind of like Black History Month.
Yeah, they stay on a certain. They recycle the same people. Mm-hmm. I'm so sick of that. So that's that's why we're doing what we're doing. We don't want to recycle the same people. Mm-hmm. We want new people, and that's why I was so glad you were able to not only come with a name, but come with other names and give us an overall story on this woman. Like she should be told. Yeah. This is somebody who really should have been talked about in history, because first and foremost, she was excuse my French, she was a badass. Yeah. She was a straight badass. She did her thing, and no one knew that she was doing her thing. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate you really coming with that story. That's awesome.
I have to give total respect to anyone, regardless of gender, age, or anything. You've got a British man of war parked outside your house.
And you standing there.
And it's like, bring it.
Just bring it. It's not going to hit the same spot twice. I'm good. I'm chilling. Mad respect to that there. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the publication, The Wives of the Signers of the Declaration of Independence.
No, I haven't.
So that one has a biography on Elizabeth Lewis in there. So I did pull a few things from that. But that might be one to check if you're looking for the stories of the female figures sort of behind the men, who you could make the argument they are supporting the war, the cause of independence, because they're supporting their husbands. They're taking care of the house. They can have patriotic sentiment in their own right.
What's the name of that magazine again, just for people who...
So this is a book. It's The Wives of the Signers of the Declaration of Independence. I had it written the exact title in here.
Just in case people didn't catch that the first time around.
Wives of the Signers.
Excellent.
the official Wives of the Signers, and then I think it's biographies of prominent female something.
Yeah,
it
that
goes on.
subtitle that just
Yeah.
runs and runs.
Exactly. So Wives of the Signers. That's the easy one to remember.
So we have another question from Martine Brennan. She's from Ireland. This is actually one of our cousins.
Okay.
And she says, do any of the records give the name of the man who is reputed to have smuggled clothes into Elizabeth in jail? She said, I've only seen him described as a black servant and a Catholic.
So unfortunately, none of the sources that I've come across have given him a name.
Oh wow!
But
I didn't even know that much. See,
I
that's
have
why
heard
love
that
my cousin.
same story that he was Catholic. There was in her great granddaughter's biography, she does say that this gentleman was Catholic, and I guess fell ill shortly after Elizabeth's release from prison. And he apparently, because they were still in New York City, so he was helping take care of her. And then when he was dying, there was no Catholic priest to be had in New York City. So Elizabeth sort of worked her magic and found one in Philadelphia that could be smuggled into New York City to read him his last rites. Once again, this is lore. This is coming from her great-granddaughter's book, so I always have to feel like I have to add that caveat. You know, this is published in 1877. It's coming way after the fact, but that's how the story goes.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, that's all the information that I have on him.
Wow. It's interrupted and now ended.
See, a documentarian or a filmmaker needs to get out there and prove that, because that would be a fascinating story.
I
Yeah.
mean, wow.
I mean,
her story is fascinating enough.
In itself.
You add that to it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, I don't know if going through the records of her husband's estate when he died might be able to help you pinpoint the name of someone. If this, I believe he died shortly thereafter, but maybe if a family member was mentioned in the estate records I'll be honest, I don't know if he was an enslaved person or if he was a hired servant. I just don't have that information.
Okay.
So,
Well, I'm kind of circulating in my head that there wasn't a Catholic priest in the entirety of New York City.
And that's what I think is a little strange.
That's crazy.
But
Like
it's
not
certainly-
one.
Because it's not like New York only had a couple of hundred people in it. I mean, New York had already been under the
Yeah.
Dutch a thriving colony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm like
So-
not one.
That's why I say, who knows if this is 100% accurate? But that's how the story goes, is that
Yeah.
she had a priest smuggled through the lines from Philadelphia to read him his last rites.
Afiba, they're saying that the video has paused and it's no sound.
Oh yeah, so I'm getting live video interrupted, but we're still going out live on
On the other one.
So if you're watching us on Listen Vision Live, if you can just hold on for just a minute,
Yeah, we're having slight difficulty.
I will put a comment saying.
But wow, she is awesome. Like
Yeah.
I'm so.
She's a good figure to
It's
focus on.
it's so wonderful when you find somebody, when you're doing your research on your family and you end up finding someone who is just like this awesome person, and you're like, yeah, that's my family.
Yeah, that's my girl.
Yeah, yeah, you like that's
Right,
mine.
that's my girl. I
She
wish-
belongs to me. Yeah, I'm a part of her.
Yeah, and I my ancestry is in predominantly Connecticut and New York, so on my father's side, I wish I had someone like this.
I'm sure you got somebody.
Maybe somebody hiding somewhere, but yeah.
So you became a member just
Yes.
recently.
October of last year.
Yeah. So how did that feel to become a DAR member?
It felt great because I joined on my father's line, obviously, because my mother's North African, so there's never going to be any line through her side for the DAR's purposes. But so it was fun because I joined through my biological grandmother, who died a long time before I was born, whose name is also Claire. So she was a Bates, and so I joined through her great grandfather Phineas Bates, who I just love that name. Like
Yeah.
Phineas, what a great first name. So it was really fun, and actually through that line I found several other possible Patriot connections. So eventually I will get around to submitting a couple supplementals.
Wow.
But yeah, it's I like it.
Okay, so can you explain, since we're on that, explain what supplementals do for someone?
Right. So obviously, when you're a first-time applicant, you submit that application, you become a member, you get your national number, cool beans. So sort of like what I was just saying is you might, in your research, have found several other ancestors or patriots in our system that you're also descended from. So you say, well, hey, I also want to join through that guy. So you basically submit another application, except you're already in the system. And you can submit, there is currently no limit for how many supplemental applications you can submit at once. We did have one that was submitted, I believe it was submitted over a year ago, and they're currently working on it now. 50 supplemental applications all at once. Were you here when that one came in the bill? Yeah.
I ran.
Yep, yeah. it was a lot. And the assistant director of supplementals is the one who's currently working on that one because, Forrest.
Okay.
Because 50 all at once is quite time consuming to go through that.
God bless it.
So those are supplemental applications, and it's for, it's really just so you can sort of document and honor your additional patriots that you've identified. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So as an African American, how hard is it for African Americans to prove their patriotism, their ancestors through that?
I would say it can be more difficult. Sometimes it's just as easy as anyone else. It just depends on your personal family and the documentation available.
Okay.
It obviously, when you're dealing with people who were enslaved, it is significantly more complicated. So in some of those cases, DNA might be useful to help you.
Yes, because DAR does use DNA.
We do take DNA. And it's one of those things that, you would have to submit that DNA in conjunction with other records and what we call an analysis, which is sort of like a way of explaining how you're using multiple documents to come to one conclusion. Mm-hmm. So I remember one that I had where the way that they had proved their link, because they were descended from, it was this guy who'd owned several slaves, and they were descended from one of the slaves who were biological children, natural children of this man. We had no one record that did indicate that they were his children, but what we were able to do is that in the inventory of his estate, this was in Tennessee, and I think in the 1840s, in the inventory of his estate, several of these men were listed as brothers. I can't remember their names off the top of my head, but what we were able to do was then trace the land that had been given to the legal heirs of this gentleman through his probate records, and then see that land had splintered off and gone to these three men who were listed as brothers in the inventory of that gentleman's estate. And so it was sort of like then, from the death certificates of their children, they were naming so-and-so as their mother, which corroborated with what so-and-so was listing. And so it was a very complicated sort of web of how we were able to establish that these men were actually getting the land that it was originally distributed to the legal heirs of this guy in his probate records. And we're seeing that the land changed hands and that they were listing each other as cousins in various records. And so it all kind of tied in together. So it can be very complicated and convoluted. So that's why sometimes DNA does come in handy if you're able to pair that with other documentation. Other times there are court records that might say, that might acknowledge a illegitimate child as a naturalized child of so-and-so, and that's something that you can use. It depends on the family and the area that you're researching and the time period. And
definitely for colonial Virginia and North Carolina, those bastardy bonds can be a real lifesaver. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember if Maryland had them. I've read accounts where people were whipped for having natural children, but I don't know if they actually had. I don't know if the father of the natural child had to pay a bond, as it were.
Off the top of my head for Maryland, I don't know, but that would absolutely be something to search in the family search catalog to see if they have that stuff digitized.
So how does the DNA portion work? How do you guys use the DNA?
So I will just straight up say I am not an expert in the DNA.
That's
we do
Maryland.
It's Maryland. We do have someone at the DAR
who pull Maryland.
Yeah, she could absolutely answer this question perfectly. So I will do my best. But usually DNA, when you're talking about something mid-lineage, it usually has to accompany other documentation to corroborate it. So, for example, if you're trying to prove, that your great-great-great-great-grandfather was the son of John Smith and Mary Smith, right? And you take, the ancestry DNA test, and it says that your fifth cousins with someone who also has a family tree that shows that they're descended from this guy. That right there is not going to be sufficient. So you might be able to use that DNA in conjunction with documentation like court records to show that, like, I'm just kind of spitballing here, but let's say we know from already previously verified lineages of the DAR that John and Mary Smith had a son, Ezekiel. And we have records that show these are the 5 children of Ezekiel, and then your DNA connects you to someone who's already proven that they're one of the... So that's sort of is how it can work together. So it usually is accompanied by other documentation. It's slightly different if you're doing just like a paternity test, you know? Because obviously we have a lot of applicants who are adopted or might not know their biological parents, so...
Yeah. Because that's the issue that I have with the SAR, but that we have in general, is that Donnie and I can actually place our enslaved mulatto ancestors with the father, who's their enslaver, through deeds and wills and probate records, letters, journals, farm books, whatever whatever you want to call it. But because they were that person's dirty little secret, there's nothing to say, oh, hooray, the 9th of March, 1777, my son Joshua or my daughter Emma was born. We ain't gonna get that.
And that's why the DAR has what we call an analysis, because then you can submit all of those deeds and court records and whatever, and an explanation of, in this record it says this, in this record it says this, when you put these two together it says this. And that, if it all adds up and it makes sense and it accounts for any conflicting information, we just look at it and we take it to someone and they sign it, and then we go, okay, and we're done. And we just move right along. Because
Although, to be fair, someone on the Sons of the American Revolutionary War Facebook page did point out, he's like, well, you can put them in the household and you know that you share DNA, that you have a DNA relation, but you can't prove that it was that man and not his brothers. Kind of a thing. I'm like, well, if all the brothers served in the American Revolution, then no matter which one it is, we're covered.
You got someone.
You got someone. But they do have a valid point on that one.
That's right.
But that's where we're really good, is we can actually get them in that household and then try our best to prove the paternity.
Yeah, we put them in there. We get them in the household. It's just proving how they're there and why they're there. And then, you have wording that kind of leads to the fact that this is probably that person's child, but it might not be enough wording to that.
Or trying to explain that to someone who's really not familiar with slave lingo, slave terminology. Because again, we have an ancestor who in 3 different wills, because he lived a very long time,
kept having to write them and
kept within the family, but they kept making special provisions for him. Not necessarily for the other enslaved.
Or for her, because we have one that does it for her. Like, she was literally pushed to the side. Everything that was done for her was totally different for what they did for the other group of enslaved people that they did, like during the labor contracts. I mean, they were saying some really harsh things to those particular people during those labor contracts. But then when they got to her, they didn't do that. Like, for this one, they say, if your child is wrong, I'm gonna beat him. Or if you're gonna do this, and the third, and this is all that you're gonna get. But then when they came to her, I'm gonna give you $600, and you're gonna take care of your kids, and I'm gonna make sure your roof is over your head, and I'm gonna do that. It was nicer for her than it was for that one. So you can tell that, okay, this is somebody that means something to you, whereas these people you don't really care about. So you got to know that, but it's
so in view of wrapping this one up, if you think you have a female ancestor that was involved in the American Revolution, would you advise visiting? Because the DAR, you can search on the DAR site for free. Is that correct? You don't have to have membership.
Yes. So if you want to see if you've identified a possible female ancestor and you want to see if they're already established in our system, you would go to www.dar.org. There will be a button that says GRS at the top of the page. That's our genealogical research system. It's comprised of several different databases, and you would search in the ancestor database to see if they've already been established in the system.
And lately I've been seeing more and more often, there's a message that comes up on some people, and I think it's all red text, where I think the DAR is going back over that's older, or if a conflict arises, or it actually looks as though you guys are going over your older records, to say, well, we're not so sure about this anymore.
Yes, so we call that coding
Code it.
an ancestor. So that usually happens when new documentation is submitted or a new application. Maybe
Yeah.
it's someone we haven't looked at in 40 years, and suddenly we have to look at everything with fresh eyes. So what's really important when you come across something like that is to pay attention to the specific code at the top in red, because that will identify what the issue is. And then there's comments underneath that'll tell you specifically what the problem is. Because if you have a code, the really common ones are FAMPCS, which stands for Future Applicants Must Prove Correct Service.
Okay.
That means that there's a problem with the service attributed to that particular ancestor, and the specific description of that problem will be in the comments below. It might say no proof of this service or something like that. Then you'll have the lineage codes, which that will always be an FAMP/C code. Future applicants must prove correct lineage is what that
Okay.
stands for. And then those same comments, just a little bit further below, will explain whether this is something that we're questioning and we're not sure if this is right or not, so we might need you to submit more proof, or we've either determined, oh, this is 100% wrong, sorry.
And I'm really, really sorry. I'm responsible for one of them, one of the William Holloways. In my own research of him and really going through things and going to archives, looking at the records, going, yeah, that William Holloway is not the father of that Reuben Holloway.
Yeah.
Sorry, DAR.
It's good that someone's got to catch it, right? Because we do the best that we can with the documentation that's submitted.
Which is all you can do, because
Right.
they're not your ancestors.
Exactly.
You're inputting information about someone else's.
Yeah, and sometimes someone will submit something and we look at it and we go, oh yeah, this makes sense. He is the son of this guy. We're good to go. And then 5 years later, someone turns up and it's like, actually, no, he's the son of his brother. And here's all the proof. And we go, oh, okay, great, thanks.
So thank you so much for
Yes,
joining us
Claire.
today.
Yeah,
And
thanks for
thank you
having me.
sharing the history of Elizabeth, because
Yes.
that's, when I was reading it and the word prison popped up, and I'm thinking, well, prison, was it kind of like a posh prison being,
Yeah.
housed with a British general? Nah, she
No.
did the
Full-on
full
prison.
deal.
She did real stuff.
So
She
all
did
credit
real
to
stuff.
you, Elizabeth. All
Yes.
credit to your ancestor, to your descendants.
Definitely a woman of history
Yeah.
that needed to be spoken. Her name needed to be said. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank
This
you
was
guys for
awesome.
joining us. Sorry about the little technical snafu. The full video will be up either later today or I promise first thing tomorrow morning.
Yes. And so next week we're going to talk with Maya Millett. Maya is giving us stories of Black women journalists in history, right?
Yes.
Yes. And heroines, that's what she calls them. Heroines of history, Black women journalists. So it's going to be really nice to talk with her and learn about some women journalists that we've never heard of before. So I'm Danya.
I'm Brian.
And thank you guys for watching us today. And we look forward to talking with you next Sunday.
See you next week.